Hi, everybody. Welcome.
Thank you.
To this webinar. I would say that we'll wait just some seconds more before we start. We have people entering the room now. Hi, Adas.
Hi, Alan.
Hi, good to see you.
Waiting to hear you.
Hi, Jack. Good to see you. Okay, so I think we shall start now, and we hope that. So it's my pleasure to have with us today Professor Eran Bar Khalifa, who is an associate professor at Ben Gurion University in Israel. And I did this, so I invite you to do this also. I visit his website to find information. Of course, I already knew him, but to have a more comprehensive idea of his projects. And you will see what a prolific researcher he is. He has currently 6 ongoing projects, ranging from dyadic co-regulation in couples to enhancing capitalization skills in couples, or mindfulness in attenuating dyadic rejection sensitivity, to name just half of them. And he has published on these and many other topics. And to give you just a few examples, let me mention some of them: therapeutic synchrony in individual therapy, alliance ruptures, congruence of attachment in psychotherapy, or the use of machine learning to identify self-reports of relationship quality. So without further ado, I would like to thank Eran for being with us today. Thank you very, very much for being able to present this webinar. We'll have one more after this, but I will talk about this a little bit at the end. So Eran, the floor is yours. Thank you for being here.
Thank you, Miguel. Can you see my screen?
Yes, yes.
Great, great. Okay, so thank you for the invitation to give this webinar and for the warm words from you. So my name is Anbar Khalifa. I'm an associate professor at Ben Gurion University, where I serve as the head of the clinical track and the head of the Relationship and Psychotherapy Research Lab. And in today's talk, I want to focus on one central line of research in our lab, focusing on interpersonal emotional regulation in the context of romantic couples. So in our lab, we mainly focused on committed marriage or marriage-like relationships. And the reason for that is that although it's no longer a requirement for social acceptance as it was in the past, still the vast majority of people aspire to marry at some point of their life or to form a committed long-term relationship at some point in their life. And actually, most of the people, many people, get married at some point in their life. So, for example, in the United States, more than 70% of men and women married by the age of 35. So it's this kind of relationship constitutes an important, significant relationship in many people's life. We all know that at least on average, or for some people, relationship satisfaction levels tend to decrease over time. So some longitudinal study actually identified 3 classes of trajectory. The first trajectory is the highly satisfied couples, the class that we all want to belong to, right? And these couples tend to start their relationship with high levels of relationship satisfaction and to show quite stable levels of relationship satisfaction over time. There is the second class, the moderate relationship satisfaction class, which begins their relationship with a bit lower levels of relationship satisfaction and show a modest decline over time. And there is about 10% of couples who start their relationship with lower levels of relationship satisfaction and this particular group shows the most robust reduction in relationship satisfaction over time. And actually, similar to other psychological disorder or conditions, marital distress or relationship distress seems to be a taxon. So, like in depression, you can measure depression continuously, but there is some threshold in which people become diagnosed with depression. It's important both for clinical interventions and diagnosis and assessment. So, about 25% of couples fall into this class of maritally discordant couples. And it's important because marital quality and marital distress is robustly associated with psychological well-being. So, for example, in one meta-analysis, the association between relationship satisfaction or relationship quality, marital quality, and subjective well-being was found both at cross-sectional and longitudinal study, and this association is quite stable across studies. Marital quality is also associated with physical well-being, with physical health. So, for example, in the recent meta-analysis on this topic, marital quality was found to be associated with better health, lower risk of mortality, and lower cardiovascular activity. And although, as you can see here, the effects are within the small-sized range, they're actually similar in magnitude to the association between more commonly or more accepted health behaviors such as diet and smoking and health outcomes. Okay, so it seems that marital quality is an important predictor of our physical health. I also want to mention that the association between relationship distress and psychopathology or distress tends to be bidirectional. So baseline levels of psychopathology tends to prospectively predict lower levels of relationship satisfaction, greater level of relationship distress, but it's true also the other way around. People in distressing relationship tend to develop some psychopathology, some kind of psychopathology, such as depression, anxiety, etc. So the key question that we try in my lab to address is to clarify the mechanisms involved in this association between relationships quality and well-being. And we have a particular focus on affective processes, on affect processes, because we assume, and it's based on an extent empirical work, that affect processes play a key role in this association. We know that our emotions are embedded within the social system, right? So many of our emotions are elicited in social context. So the social context is very important. Emotions are often experienced with our friends, with our family, with our colleagues, and intimate relationships create an interpersonal context for many of our lives' emotional highs and lows, right? So in this particular relationship, we tend to experience strong emotions of love and admiration, and some other positive emotions, but also to feel quite strong emotions such as quite strong negative emotions such as anger and sadness and loneliness, right? So it's an important context in our life for our emotional life. Another phenomenon which is particularly important in the context of romantic or close relationship is emotional linkage. Emotional linkage reflects the phenomenon in which romantic partners tend to synchronize or to be synchronized or to be linked in their emotional experience. So if my partner feels, strong feelings of sadness, it's likely that I would feel similar levels or at least, higher levels of sadness than my usual experience. So if partners' emotions are closely tied to each other, it's reasonable to assume that the way that each of the partner manage his or her emotions will affect the other partner as well. And indeed, there are some findings showing that reappraisal, which is considered an adaptive emotional regulation strategy, can buffer declines in marital quality over time. And on the other hand, suppression, which is considered a maladaptive emotional regulation strategy, was found to be associated with poor romantic relationship quality. So building on this idea, in the first study that I want to present here, we wanted to examine whether partners' capacity for emotional regulation can help them traverse one of the stressful events or periods in many couples' life, the transition to parenthood. And we know that the transition to parenthood is associated with decline in partner self-esteem, relationship satisfaction, support, and with an increase in partners' psychosocial stress and relational conflict. So we wanted to examine whether a new parent's respiratory sinus arrhythmia, which is a biological marker associated with better affect regulation, can actually serve as a dyadic protective factors, can help partners traverse the transition to parenthood and can predict or can help them to adjust better to this stressful period in life. So respiratory sinus arrhythmia reflects the variability in time intervals between successive heartbeats, and it actually captures kind of the flexibility of our cardiac system to respond to the environment. Okay, so greater variability is greater flexibility in our ability to change the arousal that is required at a specific situation. And it's a well-established biomarker of the parasympathetic nervous system control over the heart. And you can actually extract two indices out of RSA, tonic RSA, rest RSA, baseline RSA, which captures individual capacity for regulation, and phasic RSA. So it's RSA reactivity, our RSA in demanding situation, complex situation, which captures regulatory effort. So we invited 100 couples in their transition to the parenthood, and 15 weeks following the birth of the first child, we invited them into a lab session, and we attached electrodes to measure their cardiac activity, and we measured their cardiac activity at baseline, but also in two interactions in which we asked them to support each other in some challenges that they have during the first weeks after the transition to the parenthood, but also what is termed capitalization in the literature, to share with each other positive experiences related to the transition to the parenthood, and we measured their cardiac activity throughout this interaction. We then asked them to complete a 21-day daily diaries. We asked them at the end of each day to complete some items regarding the last 24 hours. We asked them about their negative affect, so we could capture their levels of negative affect. We also asked them to report on daily stressors, which helped us to examine actually stress reactivity. Stress reactivity is a very important index of mental well-being. It's the extent to which our affective system reacts to stress. So people with high stress reactivity, even minor stressors in their life, can predict or can increase high levels of negative affect. We implemented the multivariate actor-partner interdependence model without getting into too much detail. This method is commonly used when you handle dyadic data because it allows you to simultaneously examine both actor effects. So, for example, in our example, how mothers' RSA predict their own NA level, but it also allows you to examine what is termed partner effects, how mothers' tonic RSA is associated with their partner's negative affect level. So we first documented the classical intrapersonal effects of RSA. We found that mothers' baseline tonic RSA was predicted actually their NA level, lower levels of negative affect, and also lower stress reactivity. And this is the classical finding regarding RSA. But we also found partners effect. So mothers with higher tonic RSA and RSA reactivity, RSA measured during the dyadic interactions, so the RSA levels were associated with lower levels of negative affect for the fathers. But we also found that fathers' tonic RSA and RSA reactivity predicted mothers and lower levels of mothers' NA stress reactivity. So we think that this finding can speak to the dyadic protective factor of RSA and the way in which each partner capacity for self-regulation, physiological regulation, may engender benefits for the partners as well. Now I want to shift to talk a little bit about deliberate interpersonal emotional regulation. RSA is not, it's a biological marker. We don't control purposely our RSA. But sometimes people use deliberately, explicitly, their partners to handle their emotions, both negative emotions, to try to down-regulate their negative emotions, and positive emotions, to try to up-regulate feelings of pride and love, etc. So emotional regulation, I think it's one of the most commonly researched construct in psychology in general and in clinical psychology in particular, and it's traditionally defined as the processes that individuals implement to influence their own emotions, right? So it's an intrapersonal process. In recent years, there is a growing interest in the processes involved in interpersonal emotional regulation, how we use other people to regulate our emotions. And I think that it's an important emphasis because when we experience emotions, we often seek the company of others to disclose our emotions. It's a very common phenomenon. We feel something, most of the people feel other people to share these emotions. And some of the motivation for this emotional disclosure is regulation, to regulate these emotions, both positive and negative. And for many adults, the romantic relationship is a key source of interpersonal emotional regulation, or at least this is our prediction or hypothesis, because there are some findings showing that intimate partners become the leading target for emotional sharing, at least for most adults. So in this study that conducted with one of my PhD students, Ori Weisberg, we wanted to actually examine processes of interpersonal emotional regulation in couples' daily lives. We wanted to address questions such as how often do people in romantic relationships use interpersonal emotional regulation? Do couples utilize interpersonal emotional regulation independently or to complement their more intrapersonal efforts to handle their emotions? Which strategies do they commonly use? And whether interpersonal emotional regulation are effective in regulating both positive and negative emotions. So we ran this study with the support of the Israel Science Foundation. We collected data from 80 cohabiting couples, and these couples completed both experience sampling method procedure and nightly diary for 70 days. And particularly, five times during the day at random times, we asked our participants to identify a positive and negative experience that they had during the last 2 hours and to write them down briefly and to rate the emotional intensity they have now. And these are our emotional regulation targets, right? So these are potential events that can be regulated later on with their partners. Then in a nightly diary, so we asked partners to enter, we send them a link an hour before they went to sleep, and we asked them, like we presented them the most significant events from the day, and we asked them to indicate whether they use any intrapersonal strategy to address these emotions, to upregulate positive emotion, to downregulate negative emotions, whether they use interpersonal emotional regulation strategies, both with their partners or with somebody else in their lives, and to re-rate their emotional reaction to the event at night. So here are some examples of the strategies that we assess. So for example, reappraisal is, I think it's one of the most researched emotional regulation strategies, the way like to try and think differently about the event. But you can also think about co-reappraisal. So I share something with my partner in order, like I want him to help me to think differently about the negative event. So we first were concerned that people will not be able to identify emotion targets during the day, during the 5 prompts. right? And we were happy to see that both men and women, in 50%, in more than 50% of the prompts, they could identify positive experience they had during the last 2 hours, and they could identify in about 30% of prompts negative experience. So we had targets for regulation, right? So this was, this is something that we were happy to see. But then we asked the question, how often do people in romantic relationship use interpersonal emotional regulation? So let's start with negative events. And we found that the most common situation was using both inter and intrapersonal emotional regulation. So in 45% of the days in which a negative experience occurred, our participants reported using both interpersonal emotional regulation strategy and intrapersonal emotional regulation strategy. In positive emotion, the picture was very interesting. So the most common was no regulation, right? So I had positive emotion or positive experience. I don't feel any need to regulate this emotion, right? But as you can see here, in half of the time, in quarter of the times, occurrences, participants reported using both inter and intra, and in 27% of the times they indicated using only inter, right? So not trying to do anything with that, but do something with their partners or another person in their life to regulate their emotion, to increase the positive emotions. And then we wanted to address the question, who is the regulator, right? So if I regulate with somebody, it's not necessarily means that I do that with my partner, right? And as you can see, both in negative inter and in positive inter situation, the partner only was the most common phenomenon, right? So, and I think that these findings speak to the idea that our romantic partners is a key source for interpersonal emotional regulation, right? In other 37% of the occurrences, it was partner and another person, right? But it was quite rare to use another person, another partner, without a partner to regulate our emotions. Which strategies are used the most? So we found that with intrapersonal emotional regulation, people commonly use direct copying, right? So they try to do something concrete to change the situation in order to change their emotions. And it makes sense. I think that in many cases, we miss this strategy. We over focus on rumination, suppression, reappraisal. But, sometimes, and it seems, it seems like an adaptive, you try to change the situation. In terms of interpersonal emotional regulation, our partners reported that merely sharing the emotions was their strategy. I'll share my emotion, I'll share my event with my partner, the negative event, and this will help me to feel better. And it was with positive emotions, we found again that sharing was the most common strategy people use to regulate their emotions. Then we wanted to look into the regulatory effect. And first we found that, and this is accepted, that the levels of positive and negative emotions close to the event, so during the daily prompt, was higher than how they react emotionally to the event when they reported or when they refer to this event at the nightly diary, right? But we want to understand whether this change is associated with their implementation of emotional regulation strategies. And we found that in positive emotions, both interpersonal emotional regulation and interpersonal emotional regulation were associated with higher positive emotions later in the day, right? So using these strategies, both type of strategies was associated with similar levels of positive emotions at the end of the day. With negative emotions, we found something that was that surprised us. So both interpersonal emotional regulation and intrapersonal emotional regulation were actually positively associated with higher levels of negative emotions. And, we can speculate about, what these findings indicate. One interpretation is that the mere engagement, the mere attempt to regulate somebody, to regulate some event, some target, may, at least at the short term, render the event more significant in our life. But we also had participants completed more direct questions regarding the efficacy of perceived effectiveness of these strategies. So we asked them to what extent did these strategies help you reduce your negative emotions, and to what extent did these strategies help you increase your positive emotion. It was very interesting that participants, at least in our sample, reported that interpersonal emotional regulation was much more effective, and the effect size was quite strong. So interpersonal emotional regulation strategies were much more effective than intrapersonal emotional regulation in down-regulating their negative emotions. And the same, we found the same pattern of results regarding positive emotions. So to recap the finding of this study, interpersonal emotional regulation is commonly used within romantic relationship. It tended to be more effective at times than the most, traditionally research construct of intrapersonal emotional regulation. And, I think that it highlights the idea that we need to study things more interpersonally, right? So there is, lots of research on intrapersonal emotional regulation, but interpersonal emotional regulation seems at least as important to study. And of course, as clinician, the next question to address is which interpersonal emotional regulation processes characterize distress versus satisfied couples. And there are several studies in my lab that are running now that we are trying to address this question, and I want to present some preliminary results focusing on the interpersonal emotional regulation of daily positive experiences. So again, we asked couples to complete daily diaries for 21 days, and we asked them the extent to which they try each day to share positive emotions with a positive experience with their partner, and their partner's responsiveness to such attempts. So, and you can think about these two constructs as interpersonal emotional regulation attempts and the quality of the interpersonal emotional regulation. So we compared distressed couples chronically reporting relational distress with young, satisfied community couples, right? And it's easy to show that these couples are happier, right? Because they are young, they are satisfied. So we wanted to compare the distressed couples to another sample of couples, cardio couples in which one of the partner experienced a recent cardiac event. Couples that deal with some life stress, right? Health stress. And as you can see here, the distressed couple reported lower levels of interpersonal emotional regulation attempts, both from the community and from the cardio couples. And the distressed couple also reported that the quality of their attempts was much lower than the quality reported by the community, young, satisfied couples, and the cardio couples. So I think that we can say from these results that distressed partners made fewer attempts, and even when they did try, they perceived these attempts as less successful. I now want to shift to non-deliberate affective processes in distress. So as I mentioned earlier, romantic relationships, emotions tend to be tied to each one, right? So in a sense, we can think about romantic relationships as an interpersonal emotional regulation system. And in distress, we may find reduced linkage or reduced association between partners' affect, but we also may see maladaptive patterns of linkage. And the work of late Emily Butler, her model of temporal interpersonal emotional system, provides several hypotheses how adaptive and maladaptive processes of emotional linkage can be manifested. So for example, for this couple, we can see that the linkage probably helped them to feel less in distress, right? But for this couple, the linkage actually acted as a positive feedback loops in which partners got more and more escalated and more in distress. So, and when we talk about affect, we of course can talk about different channels through which the affect is manifested, our subjective experience, our voice, our physiology, our movement, and also the way that in which we express our emotions to each other, you know, facial expression, the way that we express the emotions in our face. So in one of the studies that are the project that are currently running in my lab, founded by the Binational Science Foundation, we tried to understand patterns of emotional linkage manifested via different channels, voice, physiology, facial expression, and to measure them before treatment, over the course of treatments and following treatment, and to see whether the treatment actually helps couples to change their levels or their emotional linkage into healthier patterns. And in the results that I want to present here, we focused on facial expression. And we particularly focused on smile, which is, you know, the production of, to produce a smile, we use 3 action units, 3 classes of facial muscles. And we focused on smile because smile is very common. It's the only positive facial expression, and it's the facial expression that is most easy to recognize for people. Okay, so it's an important facial expression to focus on. And actually, there are some studies with strangers showing that even strangers show high level of synchrony in their smiling behaviors, and that such synchrony is associated with closeness, with affiliative feelings. So in this study ran by one of my PhD students, Ruth Machruf, we focused on distressed couples to understand whether they show smile synchrony, whether they still maintain the capacity to reciprocate smiling behaviors, whether both in positive and in negative context, whether they show different levels of synchrony than non-distressed couples, and whether change in their distress during treatment is associated with their smile synchrony. So we collected data from 30 treatment-seeking couples and 30 satisfied couples. We matched them as much as we could. And before treatment, both groups, both samples participated in a lab assessment in which they conducted 4 dyadic interactions, discussing both positive aspects of the relationship and negative aspects of the relationship. And then the treatment-seeking couples received a course of 12 sessions of emotion-focused therapy. And before each session, we asked them to engage in another dyadic interaction. So we could measure change in their smiling synchrony over the course of treatment. And following the treatment, we asked them to report again their levels of relationship satisfaction. So these are you know, students from my lab. This is not a real couple, right? But we used Face Reader, which is, you know, there are several software that can be used to extract facial expression continuously, and we use this software to continuously extract the level of smiling behavior, of smiling activation. And with these 2 time series, we could compute the linkage between partners in their smiling behaviors. And you can see here an example that even without like running any statistic, you can see that there is high level of correspondence between the partners' levels of smiling behaviors. So our first hypothesis was that couples' smile synchrony will be higher than chance and higher during positive interactions than during negative interactions. And to examine that, we constructed, it's a common method in the literature to construct what is termed pseudosynchrony. Pseudosynchrony is when you randomly pair partners who didn't interact with each other, right? So this is the chance level, right, of showing synchrony, and you compare it to the observed synchrony. And as you can see here, so this is the pseudo synchrony distribution. As you can see that both negative interactions and in positive interactions, even distressed couple maintain some capacity for reciprocating, for aligning their smiling behaviors, and in positive emotion, in positive context, the synchrony was even higher. Then we hypothesized, we wanted to examine the hypothesis that at baseline, distressed couples will show lower levels of synchrony. Yeah, we thought that this behavior, non-deliberate behavior, may serve as a signature of distress. And as you can see here, so here are the community couples and the treatment-seeking couples. And as you can see here, the community couples showed higher levels of synchrony, both in negative context and in positive context. And we ran some multi-level model and found that both the group effect and the interaction type was significant. We then wanted to examine whether synchrony levels measured during the treatment will be associated with changing couple satisfaction. So the treatment was effective to some extent to most of the couples. As you can see here, the measurements before treatments were much lower than the two measurements following treatment. And we indeed found that controlling for pre-treatment relationship satisfaction, synchrony, smiling synchrony during the pre-session interactions that I described earlier was associated with better treatment outcomes. And of course, all the results are after controlling for partner's smile expression. So it's above, the fact that partners smiled and had positive affect. The reciprocation seemed key here. So again, distressed couples show synchrony in their smile expression. Synchrony was higher during positive than negative interaction. Synchrony was among distressed couple was lower than non-distressed couples, and it predicted changing relationship satisfaction. Okay, so again, smiling synchrony is non-deliberate, right? It's not something, it's not imitating smile. Imitating smile is a different phenomenon. It's very irritating for people when we imitate them, right? It's more spontaneous. So you can't teach people, or you don't want to teach people to reciprocate smiling. We work in therapy on things that we think that couples can practice, that couples can implement in their life, right? And one of the key intervention or key process that many different models of couple therapy focus on is the expression of vulnerable soft emotions, right? So it's the capacity of partner of expressing more softer emotions such as sadness, hurt, loneliness, rather than more hard negative emotions such as anger and resentment, right? It's a key process. And the idea behind that is that when people express their more vulnerable parts, the other partner is more likely to engage, right? And more likely to support and be there and be responsive. But most of the research on vulnerability focuses on the role of expression and experience of vulnerable emotions. But in couple therapy, the accuracy of perceiving this vulnerability is also important, right? It's not enough for one partner to express this emotion, vulnerable emotion. The other partner should accurately perceive these emotions. So in a study published with a student of mine, he focused on the interplay between partners' expression and perceptions of vulnerability in the process of changing emotion-focused therapy. And the key question was whether accuracy is associated with treatment progress. So we used data from 36 heterosexual couples who received a course of about 12 sessions of emotion-focused therapy at York University. These couples suffered from an emotional injury, such as an affair, and they came to therapy to try and get out of this emotional injury, get out of this stuckness. At the end of every session, each partner is reported on the expression of his own or her vulnerability. So, for example, I express a need for my partner's care and comfort. I express my fear of my partner's disapproval, but also reported on their perception of their partner's vulnerability. They also, at the end of each session, reported about the level of resolution, whether at this point they feel that their emotional injury is better off, right? So they made a progress in resolving their emotional injury. And we use the response surface analysis method, which is an alternative and more statistically robust method than difference scores, to actually construct a tridimensional plot which allows you to examine questions of accuracy or correspondence of matches, right? So as you can see here, on the right, we have the expression, the report regarding expression of vulnerability. On the left, the perception, and here is the outcome, which is like the level of resolution. And in this 3D plot, you can see that this is the line of agreement, of accuracy, right? So regardless of the level of expression or perception, points on this line represent correspondence between the expression and perception. And any deviation from this line represent mismatches, right, in the perceptions of vulnerability. So here is a graphical representation of the results. So as you can see, inaccuracy, so deviation from the line of accuracy was associated with lower levels of resolution. But again, and this is very interesting and intuitive, I think, underestimation of my partner's vulnerability expression was more detrimental than overestimation. And I think that one possible clinical implication of this finding is that interventions should be also, we should focus on processing partners' perception when we work with couples. It's not enough just to foster the expression of vulnerability. You want to engage with the other partner and to see, how he or she perceives that, how he or she makes sense out of it, etc. So to recap the things that I try to present here, I think that, for example, in the first study with the transition to parenthood couples, I think that it's important to address significant people in our clients or in lives, because the regulatory capacity of one partner can significantly impact the other partner's affective experience, for the better or for the worse, right? So if we have partners with great difficulties in regulating his or her emotions, it can, be a toll on our emotional life. Romantic partners frequently seek out their partners to regulate their daily positive and negative emotions, and this process of interpersonal emotional regulation is very important. At least with our sample, our participants reported that they benefited more from interpersonal emotional regulation than from intrapersonal emotional regulation. Distressed couples exhibit different patterns of interpersonal emotional regulation, both deliberately and non-deliberately, right? So they shared less of their positive emotions, they showed lower levels of smiling synchrony, and changes in interpersonal emotional dynamics, such as smiling synchrony, occurring during couple therapy, may be correlated with therapy outcome. And with this, I think that I will conclude and open for questions.
I just thank you very much, Eran. Very interesting. We have time for questions, so if anybody has one questions or comments. Okay, perhaps I may start to open the dialogue. I have one question regarding the meta-analysis that you showed about marital satisfaction and health outcomes, both.
I think that there are some connection problems, right?
We can't hear you, Miguel. Or are you freeze?
I lost connection, right?
Yeah, but we can hear you now.
I can hear you now. Shall I try again?
Sure.
Okay, the question was that you show meta-analysis showing a correlation between marital satisfaction and health outcomes. And I was wondering, because there are also studies that show that social support has a clear relationship on health outcomes, if there are any studies that disentangled marital satisfaction from the perception of social support.
This is a very interesting question, I think, because I think that this may operate at different levels, right? Because a great source of support is often received within our romantic relationships, right? So I'm not sure that we need to tease it apart in the sense of, controlling for each other, because I think that these processes are associated. And I think that there are some studies showing, for example, that lack of spousal support, is, above and beyond lack of other, like support from other sources. The specific lack of, you cannot, to some extent, compensate on lack of spousal support. So I think that spousal support is part of what we refer to when we talk about marital quality, right? So I have a person that I can rely on and is there with me, for me. So I think that part of the effect of perceived support and health is associated with, having people with good relationships, right?
Okay. Thank you very much. And it makes sense, of course. I was just wondering if methodologically there was some way of separating support from friends and family from marital support, and if there is a way of compensating. But what you said makes perfect sense.
Right, but there are studies showing that the lack of spousal support, even if you have support from your friends and from your colleagues and your
Not enough.
It's not enough. It's important, but it cannot compensate for a distressing relationship. And at least you live with this person, right? So you can have lots of and as a couple therapist, I can say that many people come and say, outside my house, life is different. Right? I'm calm. I'm somebody that people trust on, right? And the situation is very different in the relationship. So I think that it's an attachment relationship, right?
Adas, you had a question, right?
Okay, thank you, Eran. That was very, very interesting and well presented. I wondered about the couples and the transition to adulthood. Continuing on the point about support, we know that postpartum depression often occurs because of lack of spousal support. Did you have any data on that in terms of what the new mothers expected from the new fathers? And also, under very stressful conditions, would suppression, would encouraging my partner to suppress be productive?
Say it again, to encourage my partner.
Let's start with the first question.
Yeah. So we examined this group of couples 15 weeks following the birth of the child. It's too early to talk about postpartum depression in most cases, and these couples were functioned enough to come to the lab, right? So it wasn't like
Right.
So we can talk about postpartum depression. It was very soon, very early in the transition to parenthood. But we know that negative, high level of negative affect and stress reactivity, strong response to even minor daily stressor are key features of depression, right? So it may be that these are early indicators of the parents, and we should say parents, right? Because both mother and father sometimes develop depression following this transition.
Right,
it's an identity transition. So it may be that what we captures are, at least to some extent, early indicators of risking indicators. But we also need, I think it's also important to remember what I said early in the presentation, that the association between marital distress or relationship distress and psychopathology is bidirectional, right? So it's very hard to be with depressed, anxious partner, right? So we always need to take this into account, right?
Yeah.
What was the second question?
I was just wondering if under very extreme stressful situation, like war or something like that, whether encouraging the partner to suppress as an emotion regulation strategy is beneficial, or it has some positive effect.
Very interesting, right? Because we, as a psychologist, we don't like suppression, right? It's like the bad guy, right?
It's counterintuitive.
Right, but there are findings in the emotion in the more classical intrapersonal emotional regulation, for example, literature. So I think most studies and most meta-analyses show that reappraisal is good, suppression is bad, right? But there are more nuances into that, right? Because we know, and the work of Gal Sheps from Tel Aviv University actually shows that alternating, being flexible enough to alternate between strategies is probably the most helpful thing. So, and I think that it's the same with couples, right? You don't want to talk about emotions all the time.
Right.
So you don't want to be vulnerable all the time. You need to be able to alternate between different modes in your relationships, right? And I think that, I don't have data on that. And this is something that we will be able to analyze in the future, because we collected both suppression and all these strategies. But my hypothesis at this point would be that, the flexibility in using different strategies is more important than a specific strategy, right? And
thank you. That's interesting and convincing.
Other questions?
Mina, I can't hear you. I don't know if it's just...
Yes.
You hear me now?
Yeah.
Okay, thank you so much. Aaron, thank you so much for this great presentation. I really appreciate that you cover like a really broad, a lot of concepts, and also like, because most of the research on emotional regulation couples, it comes to those survey or scales that like reporting, but there's a lot of physiological data that you're using to do the research. So like it's really fascinating to see all the results that you and the findings that you have together with the students in your lab. I do have one question about, I wonder, what do you notice about the gender differences when it comes to emotional regulation in heterosexual couples? As a junior researcher, like I had a very few, not worth mentioning, research that I found that when it comes to emotional regulation in heterosexual relationships, the females usually they have more emotional, they have a more awareness about they feel something. Meanwhile, clinical data or other like a broad affective science shows that females in general they actually have more emotional regulation difficulties, for example, impulsivity or lack of emotional strategies. So I wonder, like, what are your studies, especially when it comes to the physiological data part, shows the gender differences in couple emotional regulations?
Yeah, good question. I think Yeah, so I think that when we look into physiology and more, you know, measures that do not rely on self-report, we see much less gender differences. Okay, so I cannot say that we see more physiological arousal or distress in female partners than in male partners, right? It's true that in self-report you see some of these differences, but maybe related to socialization, how it's allowed to report on difficulties, etc. Right? So in our samples we don't see like very. Sometimes you need to control for gender, etc. And sometimes we find some gender differences, but they are not very strong. Okay, so this is one thing and the other thing that I want to say, you talked about different facets of emotional regulation. You can have high emotional awareness, but still have difficulties regulating these emotions. So these are different facets. And when we talk about, we need to look into emotional regulation as a multifaceted construct and not as something, that like basically we look into reactivity, but it's not only reactivity. There are different constructs. And in the context of couple therapy, sometimes it's true that, men can come into the therapy room and say, everything is okay. I don't know what she wants from me, right? Everything, and the woman is very sometimes expressive, but still, when you think clinically, both are remote from their more vulnerable parts, right? So, and this is what we want to get into, like in therapy, we want to get into more their vulnerability, right? Because we believe, and there are some findings supporting this belief, that helping couples engage in more, in more vulnerable parts of themselves and expose these parts, right, is what actually change patterns of emotional regulation in their lives, right? So for me as a clinician, even if I get, some very expressive man or woman, and the other one is more withdrawal, it's the same, right? Because they're not engaging in productive emotional regulation strategies.
Thank you.
Virpi-Liisa?
Thank you. I'm Virpi-Liisa Kykyri from University of Jyväskylä, Finland. Thank you, Eran, for your very excellent presentation. I was interested in the design in the last study you reported about the couple therapy. And I was wondering whether you considered or actually did include video recording of the sessions to your design to get access to the actual behaviors between the couple during the session.
Yeah. So we collected the videos of the sessions, and now we actually look like we have students watching the entire session and identify segments in which partners engage in vulnerability, responsiveness, enactment, which is a key intervention in emotion-focused therapy, right? And so we are now processing the physiology data, because we also collected physiology data during the session. So we try to, we now processing the physiology data and their facial expression. And, in couple therapy, there are 3 people in the room, at least 3 people, right? So now we have the synchrony between the partners, but we also have the synchrony between the therapist and each partner, right? So there is a system now of synchronies.
Yes.
Right. So, it's exciting, but it's a labor-intensive work to do that. Just to go over, but of course, these are very interesting questions that we hope that if Miguel will invite me to another webinar in 2 or 3 years, I will be able to speak more into the data that happened within the session, because I think that this is most important for us as clinicians, right?
Yes. And thank you for your response, and I'm really looking forward to learn more about your findings, and perhaps we could also discuss a bit more about this issue later, because this is what we have been doing quite nearly these things we have been doing in Jyväskylä in the relational mind research, where we have two clients and two therapists, and we have also used this kind of design where we have recorded physiology and calculated synchrony and have video recordings. So we could perhaps discuss this later.
I would love.
Later on.
I would love.
Yeah, that would be great.
Thank you.
You.
Okay, I think we have time for one more question, and then we need to close if there is a question. Actually, I have another curiosity about your data, which is very, very interesting. The idea that interpersonal emotional regulation is better than intrapersonal. This is really very, very interesting from a relational perspective, right? And now, the data that you showed about couples in health distress, in cardiac, they have a lower interpersonal emotional regulation, right?
So you're speaking about the cardio couples?
Yes.
So this was very surprising and interesting finding for us, because people after a cardiac crisis, and we collected data like about a month and a half after the first cardiac event.
Yes.
Of the men. Okay. And they actually reported even higher levels of higher levels of emotional sharing and responsiveness than young satisfied couples.
Wow.
And this is very interesting, right? Because my interpretation of this finding is that people are following a very dangerous event kind of feel grateful for survive this event and having a partner, and kind of before running back to our routines, start to appreciate what they have. So this is my interpretation. Okay. Right? I don't know if it's right, but intuitively it seemed to me that there is some existential gratefulness, I would say, right? So I feel grateful for surviving this.
Yes, but if I understood correctly, the interpersonal emotional regulation was lower, right? Than the
no, it was higher. Showed higher level.
Okay.
Community couples.
Okay, I understood that it was lower. Okay, my mistake.
Right.
Okay. Now that makes sense. Okay. Okay, Aaron. Thank you very much.
Thank you for the invitation.
To all of you for this nice discussion. It was very, very nice, both the presentation and discussion. And let me just say that we'll have the last webinar of this series on the 13th of June with a webinar by Marcus Wolf with the presentation titled Digital Mental Health, Hope and the Real World. And if you have not registered and if you are interested in doing so, please do it. And also to remind you that all these webinars are being recorded and posted in our website at European chapters, so you can revisit this later and see the ones that you have missed. And once again, thank you very much for being here. It was great to see you all. Okay, bye-bye.
Bye-bye.
Bye. Thank you.